came up with this little idea of the once and future queen, 3 women across 200 years, 1915, 2015, and 2115, and what their lives are like living in a society where information technology is changing the shape of the world around them, and how they respond to those changes. So here we have a picture of a woman. This is an actual portrait that was done in 1915 of a woman reading a book. And the technology that's come about for her and for her brothers and sisters of the era in the last century or so is universal literacy. So in 1915, literacy, adult literacy in the United States, the rate of illiteracy dropped into the single digits, having been up in the 10 to 20% range, owing largely to the reduction in black illiteracy after the end of the Civil War, but even in the white population, we saw something like a 50% reduction in illiteracy. And so we had, in America and worldwide, a new kind of class of citizen where in the past, people had been literate. People have been literate throughout forever, and we'd had public education since the 1700s. But by and large, literacy for most people was used so you could read a farm bill, you could read some basic newspaper stuff about who's at war with who, you could read the Bible, and that was kind of it. It wasn't really a daily practice. It was really something more like we would regard maybe playing a musical instrument or having a hobby. It was something you were conscious of your ability to do. It was a skill like driving a car. And it was something that your ability to really apply in your daily life and your need to apply in your daily life was limited. You could be an illiterate person and function fairly well in society if you could learn to sign your name, basically. Right? Okay. And around 1915, so we had the Civil War in America. We had emancipation, which was driven not just by a conflict over sovereignty and resource usage, but over slavery and the correct application of civil rights to allegedly free society and that kind of thing. These are ideas, these are strong ideas that came up 50 years earlier. In Russia, we had the Bolshevik Revolution 10 years before this. We had communists who overthrew the previous regime based largely on an idea of idea-driven revolution based on Marxism and based on the notion of social equality, and that you shouldn't have rich people and poor people. You should have a society that learns how to work together for everyone's common good. In America, we had in her time here, her more pressing issue would be women's suffrage, the idea that women were equal citizens and had the right to vote, and that it wasn't just a man's world, but also that women had their own political interests that were separate from men's, especially regarding consumption of alcohol in public and things like that. And so she would be reading all these ideas, Susan B. Anthony and Marx and Adam Smith, and it would be fulfilling her head more than, say, her mother or her grandmother, who might have, as I said, known pretty much how to read the Bible and a farm bill, and that's kind of about it. Okay. So, move forward to nowadays, Miss 2015. For Miss 2015, for you and I and for the rest of us, reading is something that we take for granted. It's not something that we think of as a conscious skill that we apply. In fact, it would be very difficult. How many of you think you could get through a day without reading anything? You'd have to be in a coma, right? Just even forget college and books and whether you read for pleasure. Trying to avoid text, you wouldn't be able to watch any television, you wouldn't be able to read the signs in the street. It's assumed. It's pretty much a biological function. You're, unlike Miss 1915, who has a skill that she learned probably around age 8 or 9, you have, in your minds, probably can't even remember when you couldn't read, right? You have some memories from that time, but I certainly don't have any conscious ability to recall looking at text and not comprehending what it says, right? Except for 1 or 2 examples in like the first grade where I was having difficulty with C versus K or something like that. But by and large, even going back to my earliest memories, I feel as though I'm somebody who could read, even though I probably couldn't in my earliest memories. That's how basic reading is to us. It's infused in our nature. It's in our DNA. It's in our technology. Her main source of information was newspapers, magazines, maybe later on the radio, that kind of thing. Miss 2015's main source of information is the internet, right? She's socially connected to people around the world, where Miss 1915 is socially connected to people around the neighborhood, maybe around the city, right? And she has access to a wide variety of different points of view and sources of information, and she has become accustomed to the idea that at any time she can stop and get an answer to any pertinent question in her life. When was this building built? How late is California Pizza Kitchen open? What time are all my friends meeting at this bar? Are we at war with Syria? All of this in the same place. But like Miss 1915, for her, the interface, and for you and for me and all of us, the interface to this world is artificial. It feels artificial. It feels like like most of us operate a phone the way we operate a car. It's second nature. We understand it, but we also remember learning it. We remember learning whatever. Even if you grew up with technology, the interfaces you're using today are very different than the interfaces used when you were a child, and the capacities of the technology are very different. So we have Miss 1915's view of being in a connected, social, device-based information society. It's something artificial to us that we really enjoy. Miss 2115 here, for her, access to information technology is going to feel the way that reading feels to us, okay? She is going to probably not be able to remember a time when her sensory environment wasn't filled with data, filled with readouts and displays and things like that. And it might not even be readouts and displays. If there are surgical implants for information, they might bypass the visual cortex altogether. She might experience Twitter by directly experiencing the thoughts and the feelings of the people who tweet whatever they're tweeting when they tweet it, without having to artificially read. To her, the idea of reading a news story might be as strange to us as reading a news story in Morse code, right? It's certainly something you could do. You could bother to learn Morse code. It's not something that modern people do. We think of text. For her, she might actually not even be able to read the way that we do. Entire whole experiences might be translated in languages that are directly targeted to reproduce those experiences, and English might not ever be considered a basic thing. It might be considered an archaic skill, like Morse code or like Sanskrit or something like that. Okay. So probably all of you here are familiar with this basic feeling. We're in the middle of this kind of revolution. We're clearly using technology that's rapidly evolving, rapidly to a point where, like, computers have kind of settled at a certain point. They don't get much more advanced now, but phones are changing every week, right? But the question is, how are we getting to, let me skip the demographics slide, forget the demographics. How are we getting to this brave new world where we are all these socially connected, augmented reality, floating virtual avatar people, right? Is it naturally occurring by elements in human nature? Is it just facilitating human nature the way vehicles like cars sort of do, right? Where it's like humans need to move, humans can sit, humans can point and look. Here you go, human nature suggests the car. Humans can ride a horse, let's make an electric one, right? Or is it a conspiracy? Is it a big plan? No. What it is it's a set of tools that are being very, very consciously applied to utilize us pretty much as a technology, to become part of something that is connected and fits together and speaks to itself in a way that we've been understanding for about 100 years and that we're starting to apply. And so one of the movements that's doing this is quantified self. Okay, so the quantified self movement is one leg of this evolution toward Miss 2015 that we're moving toward. Is the idea that your devices, kind of starting now, but really in the next 5 or 10 years, are going to be tracking much, much more of your individual biometric data than they do currently. Your heart rate, your galvanic skin response, whether you're awake or asleep, your breathing, your environment. Is it humid? Is it warm? Is there direct light? Is there indirect light? Is it dark? Okay. Your environment's going to be starting to get recorded, kind of like a tricorder, Star Trek, and attached back to inferences that we make about your behavior with this device. Okay, and the quantified self movement is a series of people developing apps and different kinds of things to help you to lose weight or to quit smoking or drinking or to do other things by using data visualization, peer pressure through social networking, your biometric behavior as read by a mobile tracking device to feed back to you information about your behavior that people are not used to having. Most of us have a fairly delusional point of view about what we do with a day, how many Cheetos we eat, how long we sleep, how much time we spend, studying versus this or that. If we actually see the data, it's not delusional, but it's inaccurate. The data reveals things to us about ourselves, about our behavior, that can be surprising, And like I had a friend years ago, not in a quantified self way, but she just started writing down every time she bought alcohol in a bar, and she's not alcoholic, but she was shocked at how many drinks she was consuming a week because just of socialization and whatnot. And when she cut it in half, her life drastically improved. It wasn't about an intervention. It was just about I cannot believe I'm putting out $100 a week on this. I should be at $50 a week, right? Kind of thing. Okay. Okay, we did all that. So, along with the quantified self, there is the connection between the devices that we're creating, okay, to create the social pressure. And back in the 60s, they used to say, in a few movements, including feminism, that the personal is the political. Okay, that's where I got the title for this slide. What that meant was that when you're looking at your everyday life, your sort of Mad Men life and your family values and that kind of thing, that the choices you're making to be in a family structure, or to be in love with this person or that person, or raise your children in a certain way, also reflect the politics of how you as a class of person are being perceived in the world and exercising your power in the world. So there was a lot of question about could you be a feminist and a housewife and a mother? There was no clear answer to that, because if you're reinforcing certain things that are counter-feminist, that might not make you a feminist. On the other hand, if you abrogate your choices and give up something that you really want and is actually feeding your life, that's also not a very feminist thing to do. So the political consequences of the choices you make, either way, right, mattered to people because they'd communicated these ideas. Because since 1915, we've been putting out, here's an idea of what it's like to be this type of person, a capitalist, a communist, a feminist, or whatever. And then, are you living your life according to those things, right? That became a way of thinking that hadn't quite existed before. You didn't think about what type of person you are and whether you're living up according to some sort of ideology. Right? Now we can capture the personal, the geosocial local, okay? You can have friends, geo, across the world who can feed back at you from totally different cultures about your attitudes and especially about your perceptions of yourself as an American or something else like that. We have access to how the world perceives us that most people didn't have in 1915. Right? It's social. You have friends. A lot of them are going to be your actual friends, people you really know, especially in an environment like this where you have a fairly dense population. But then you're going to scatter throughout life, and you'll keep, it used to be that you'd kind of write a Christmas letter or keep in personal correspondence to people, and it was a laborious act. Now it's, I chime in on people on the phone that I haven't seen in 20 years, but that I talk to every day. And it's local. You can get information about what's happening right here, right now. If you're bored, if you're at a tedious colloquium presentation and you just want to get a drink right after it, you can find out if anybody's meeting in a bar around here. Right? And so all of these technologies are being used to advance our wellness, to improve our lifestyle, to improve ourselves as people. We're going to exercise more and that kind of thing, and to improve ourselves socially. Very important is that we now have levels of friendship, types of we talk about now adequately about the different kinds of circles that we have people in. It used to be that only very highly connected social people spoke that way, about people who were just associates and close friends and inner circle of trust and all that kind of stuff. That talk existed in 1915, but only among only in limited context. Nowadays, everybody's got this idea that you don't want your mom to see certain things on Facebook and all this kind of stuff because you're responsible for maintaining your social network. And where it's a learned skill for certainly for my generation and likely for yours, it's going to be something that people are thinking about from age 4 or 5. From here on in, it'll be second nature that you manage your social calendar the way that a socialite would have a century ago. The other leg here, so we have quantified self, we have the personal context into which you put your quantified data. What difference does it make if your heart was racing? It matters if you're falling in love or if you're running a marathon, so we want to get that down. And then the third element of this is how we can augment the environment to feed back to you. Here you have sort of a Google Glass style thing where you can learn how to fix a car by seeing the red and the green being projected on it and say, you fix this and change that. You can play games, there can be monsters running around the street or whatever. You can, when you're shopping for a home, you can whip out your iPad and scroll past all the different kinds of listings for the homes on this block. You can perform open heart surgery without any training. And basically what we can do is we can use these devices to project information onto the world that feeds back to you. So that's the complete cycle of technology that we have. Devices that read our bodies, that share that data in some processed way with our social environment and with the world, and then project feedback onto the world that allow us to optimize that data for us, to reduce our drinking, to increase our exercise, to do those kinds of things. That this is the being that we're creating ourselves for. And it's not just naturally evolving, because the piece that's missing from all of this, the part that's missing from all of this is, how do we all think about it? How do we conceptualize our relationship to this type of person that we're becoming? And where do those concepts come from? Now, I want to preface all of this by saying I am not a psychologist. Okay, so I'm not making any claims about the clinical applicability of what I'm about to present here, or the scientific accuracy of any of it. These are tools that we're using in industry now to begin to understand how human psychology is going to work with this relatively brand new form of literacy, social techno-literacy that we have. These tools, it's up to you to decide whether they have any merit to them or not, and but it's worthwhile to understand them, because likely if you go out into the world of developing mobile apps and that kind of thing, you're going to run across these things. And it's also interesting to understand the history of how these tools have been applied in the past, successfully and unsuccessfully, at different stages of the development of pretty much of who we are, of modern humans. So, with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about something pretty interesting. So this guy here is Sigmund Freud. You guys have heard of Sigmund Freud? Raise your hands. Okay. Father of modern psychology. A lot of ideas that people feel are been pretty much debunked, but still very highly respected for other insights that he's had, and for pretty much correctly diagnosing a lot of the problems and then offering a wackadoodle book full of solutions to them that don't work. Right. The reason that Freud continues to have so much influence on the way that we look at the world, even though we don't really apply Freudian psychotherapy to people very much anymore, is because of this man over here. This is a guy, this guy's had more influence on your life than anybody you've never heard of. His name is Edward Bernays, and he was Sigmund Freud's nephew. And this is Anna Freud, his daughter. Eddie Bernays was living in America when Freud was working on his ideas, and he had his famous uncle. And he's basically the original madman. He developed the modern science of advertising. He coined the term propaganda, which he meant to be used as a positive term, meaning persuasive, persuasive text, essentially. And he was responsible for creating pretty much the current economy that we have of manufacturing desire in people and then paying it off. To tie back to women's suffrage, his most famous campaign I think it was in the 20s, was called the Torches of Liberty campaign. And the problem was that smoking cigarettes was not considered a very socially acceptable thing for men or women to do, but certainly not women. Like, women never smoked in public. The men who smoked in public were all kind of considered lower class or rough or whatever. And cigarettes were basically not a sort of a high society or a feminine thing. And he had an office in New York where you could see the Statue of Liberty, and she's got the torch, right? And so he said, and he was working for Lucky Strike. And he said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get women to buy cigarettes and light them and march down the street in Manhattan in protest for women's suffrage, right? And in proclaiming their right to vote, holding cigarettes up over their head as the torches of liberty, to represent their breaking out, their independence from the gender roles that had made cigarettes inappropriate for them, right? And it worked. You know, by the 30s, women were smoking at the same rate that men were, right? And men started smoking in public much more frequently. That kind of advertising, of connecting your personal to your political, saying you smoke because you don't let anyone tell you not to. And then that's, then just like you're not going to let anybody tell you not to vote. That became the pattern that it repeated again and again and again throughout advertising, and it's a fascinating topic. Meanwhile, Sigmund and his daughter are in Europe, and of course we're having, you know, the problems of post-World War I and the rise of fascism, and they entered into World War II, and they saw the horrors to which the European population was being put. They ultimately fled. Freud died of cancer, and his daughter lived on for a couple more decades in America with her cousin, pushing these same ideas from another angle. So how many of you have ever seen those little movies from the 50s, how to tie your shoes, you know, how to comb your hair, how to brush your teeth? All right, did it ever occur to you that it seems a little bit strange that there was so much, like this felt like something people teach each other. You don't really do a movie about it. It seems to be a bit of an odd thing. That was part of a concerted campaign on the part of Anna Freud, based on a theory, and a lot of supporters, but Anna Freud was kind of the head of it. The theory said this: look, we had the Holocaust in Germany, and the Holocaust was a democratic process. This wasn't some tyrant who came in from outer space. This is somebody who was elected, and a population who broadly supported horror. Sigmund Freud presented us the idea that the human mind is this roiling bundle of chaos and conflicted sexuality that is at any time likely to erupt itself into chaos. And what we have to do in order to prevent another Holocaust is we have to create a system of social, oddly, a system of social conformity that's so rigid, but so pro-social, that it will satisfy the need that the Nazis were serving in terms of giving everybody a national identity and everything else, and it'll do it in a harmless way by not attaching it to genocide and to other kinds of things. She was saying we basically have to tame this beast. And what the Nazis did is they tamed it the way you tame gasoline or fire. They set it on fire. We need to suppress it. And that's where all that whole 50s thing kind of came from, was this PTSD, that's collective PTSD that the civilized world had, especially in America too, because that's where she was really operating, over the horrors of World War II. All right. In the course of doing this, so how many of you grew up watching TV and you'd see something on TV and you decided you wanted it because of a commercial, like cereal, a toy, maybe something you had never heard of, now you can't live without it, right? That mechanism, everybody certainly younger than me and in my generation knows that experience of seeing a McDonald's commercial and wanting a McDonald's burger. The mechanism in you that does that responds to that, was engineered by people who had the intention, obviously, of selling, we understand that, but also of creating a just society where we didn't all butcher each other. Because if I can make you happy by selling you a burger or a toy or some cereal, then you're not going to get happy by burning down someone's business or rounding them up and putting them in a camp. This was an engineered idea. And they invented something. They invented the notion of the self. This movie here, I recommend, The Century of the Self. You can still get the chapters of it. It's a 4-part documentary that the British did in the early 1980s about the specific manufacturing of the idea of self that we all have, that we all take for granted, the way that Miss 2015 takes her literacy for granted. They were building it like Miss 1915. They were constructing the way that public literacy was constructed. They constructed the idea that you all have in your head that my life is my own. I'm here to pursue my own happiness while respecting the rights of others, and I expect to have opportunities to pursue that are practical, that are being provided for me by economic activity, and I get to choose how I'm going to interface with that. That very attitude that we all have was built on purpose. Because people believed it was a way to sell things and a way to preserve freedom. So, what are the actual tools that we use? So that's the big picture idea. We were created as engines of happiness. in order to prevent us from becoming discontent and miserable and insane. But you can't just do that. You have to think of some tools. So some of the tools that we're still using, and I've been in app development for a while, video game development, these are all about providing these kinds of reward mechanisms, are really some of the very basic tools that were developed in the 20th century. The first idea is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, Abraham Maslow presented this notion that there's a hierarchy to our needs, and if we don't meet the needs that are at the lowest part of the hierarchy, the most simple and basic, the needs that are up above won't get met. So, like, obviously physiological, you need air, you need food, you need water, you need immediate comfort, safety, you need to be able to sleep at night and have some security, you need some self-esteem, you need to feel like you're a decent person who's leading a good life, and you need to be self-actualized. You need to be able to create an image of yourself and actually produce it and distinguish yourself from the rest of society. And if you don't have safety and and friendship and love in your life, self-actualization and self-esteem won't do you. You'll have very little energy to pursue these things. That each one depends on the one below it. When we go and we design games and apps and things like that, this is one of the first structures we play in. We say, let's get you started off, maybe not physiological need level, but maybe in a video game we say, okay, you need to get, like Minecraft, you got to get to safety because it's going to turn out to be night, but then eventually you get to the point where that's not such a problem, and blah, 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 right? The loops that we create in games that give you some feedback and then throw you back down and feedback are all about moving you up and down this hierarchy to get you to higher and higher kinds of achievements in the game that feel better and better, more spiritual, more enlightened, more big picture, less immediate, less feed yourself, less that kind of thing. So that's the first idea, is where do we place someone in terms of what their immediate emotional priorities are, and how can we best serve those needs, even if they're virtual and abstract, even if it's a video game where there's no actual physiological danger, we're still setting off those triggers. Then what kind of person are you? And how are you going to navigate Maslow's curve? What choices will you make that will get you there? And here we deal with personality tests that have been developed over the 20th century. These are controversial. This is where we're getting into, again, this is Carl Jung started us down this path. He's the counterpart to Freud. And like Freud, a lot of his ideas at this point are kind of considered sort of fanciful. And cognitive neuroscience has revealed more detail about how personality emerges, and it's a little more complicated than basic types. But these tests have some merit because they're about self-selection. So Jung developed basically a dual-axis system with two types that you could be on. You can be thinking or feeling, right? So do you motivate yourself primarily by your conceptions about how things work, or by your emotions about how you feel about how things are? And then the other one is intuition versus sensation. Are you motivated, or do you make decisions? So the first is how you respond to your environment. You respond by thinking about it, or you respond by feeling it. And obviously we all do both. It's a question of which you prefer. How much do you lean toward one and not the other, right? The other axis was about how you make decisions. Okay, how do you choose between A and B? Do you do it based upon how you think things ought to work? All right, that's intuition. Right, so like you have an intuition about how an automobile ought to work just from your understanding of physics, and okay, I get the idea. Or do you go based on your sensation, your experience of it working? Okay, I'm feeling it rumble, I'm hearing it grind, that's probably not right, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and again, everybody does both things, we just lean more on one or the other. And Jung characterized people by how they fell on these axes, which are dichotomous. You're more of one and you're less than the other. The test that's used today, most frequently in sort of the pop world, is the MBTI. It's called the MyersBriggs Type Indicator. Has anybody heard of this one? Myers-Briggs. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Myers-Briggs took Jung's axes, okay, and they basically added another one for judging versus perceiving. And what judging versus perceiving is, and by the way, Jung also had introversion, extroversion, which I don't have on my grid there. Do you gain energy from interaction with people and lose it when you're alone, or do you gain energy when you're alone and then spend it when you interact with people? That's extroversion versus introversion. Myers-Briggs added judging versus perceiving, right? Which is where and what judging versus perceiving is basically which of these two categories do you use to guide your decision making? Do you use your sense or intuitive side, or your thoughts and your feelings. Where Jung essentially said, this is where decisions are, this is where judgment is, period. Myers-Briggs said, actually, it's not so clear which one you're using to make choices and which one you're using to perceive the world. So we're going to give you a fourth category there. Now, as you know, anybody who's played around with MBTI, especially on Facebook and things like that, know it's incredibly popular because it gives you 16 type categories that you can be. They're all very archetypal. Okay, and it gives you a 4-letter code that's you. The big criticism of this is that that kind of dichotomous 4-letter code thing is very limiting. And so the personality test that's preferred in psychology these days is called the Big 5 personality trait test. It's essentially the same kind of thing, except for they added a 5th category, which is called neurosis, which is probably the most important personality trait that you have. How dominated are you by negative feeling? All right, how down do you feel about yourself and about other things versus up? That probably drives more of your decision making than introversion, extroversion, or anything else. So they added neurosis, and they made the categories non-dichotomous. You can be, you're just a certain level of extroversion, that's it. You just have a certain level of organization, that's it. You're not labeling people as organized, disorganized, it's just that you're at a certain level. The problem with the Big 5 is that it's a fuzzy vector. It just gives you 5 floating point values. And so people are less into it because you can't easily group people in a kind of a pop way. MBTI is going to remain popular for the applications I'm talking about because people like it. All right, so whether it's more accurate or not doesn't really matter. People like it. So here's a basic breakdown of the MBTI type of groups. I won't go into it too much, but you can see that essentially we have these archetypal types. Are you a champion? Are you an architect? Are you an operator? Are you an inspector? Right, based upon how you act on this test. It's very important, anybody here who plays with these tests, the MBTI is not an aptitude test and it is not a behavioral test. It's not something that describes how you will behave or what you'll be good at. It describes your attitude about yourself. It's entirely self-reported. No one else reviews it, no one verifies your answers. It's how you conceive of yourself, not how you really are. So plenty of introverts like myself are fantastic public speakers. We really connect with the audience. We love being around you guys. It just takes energy, right? And being alone restores energies. Sometimes I don't like to be alone, but it's restorative for me. Plenty of thinkers, use their feelings to make decisions. They just have rationally decided that their emotions are important to them, right? So it's not behavioral. It's not an aptitude. But what it does give you is a kind of personal cultural identity with fictional figures. And this is one of the things that people really like. It's like, well, I'm like House, or I'm like, the Emperor, or I'm like Spock, right? And that kind of thing. It allows you to associate yourself with celebrity. And of course, the association that we have with celebrity is one of the big manufactured views of ourself thing that the Freuds put in our heads throughout the 30s, and 40s, all through the 60s and 70s, right? The idea of a modern celebrity, the Kanye mode and the Kardashian mode of thinking about people was invented back then, specifically to give us people that we'd identify with, leaders that we'd identify with, who again won't inspire us to go marching people off into camps. They were not going to be political leaders, was the idea. We elected Ronald Reagan, so maybe that didn't work out so great, but the idea of celebrity is one of these curative ideas, and this is a refinement on that, where it's like, I can get you a whole, this is like fantasy football. I can get you a whole team of celebrities that you identify with because you're one of these types, or you're a closely related type, off by one letter, and so you like this group of people, right? And that's very much how we start when we do apps that are trying to get some personality information, deciding what things we want to present you, what you're going to like and what you're not going to like. These kinds of shortcuts, help us out quite a bit, especially if people put a lot into it. It's a little bit like astrology. The difference is that with astrology, you're being assigned something just based upon your birthday. Here, you're being assigned something based on questions you've answered about yourself. So it's more likely to actually be apt to you and not to be reduced to a simple set of things that are universally apt to everybody, because we can actually cluster things about like, well, I actually do like this and don't like that. It doesn't matter where Mars was when I was born. What does matter is whether I like hanging out with my family, right? And then we can apply different matrices of Myers-Briggs types. So here's the Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul. Which character, it's kind of like the which character are you tests. They're derived from a Myers-Briggsian approach, and they're outrageously popular. Here's a Game of Thrones one. I also had a Harry Potter one up there as well. So we can also go the other way. Instead of just saying, who are you and which cloud of celebrities do you want? Well, you're a Game of Thrones fan. Here's how everybody reacts, and then your understanding of how the other Myers-Briggs types react gives you some aptness. It's like, yeah, I expect Sam to be that kind of guy because he's one of these personality types. It gives us a shorthand for understanding characters and for delivering media to people in a way that they find pleasing because they've already invested in MBTI's validity for themselves. So applying it to fictional characters for shows that they like is irresistible. Okay, shows that you like, though. The difference between reality and fiction is that fiction has to make sense, right? Reality is under no obligation to make sense. What that means is that when we tell a story, when we tell Breaking Bad, when we tell Game of Thrones, when we tell any of these things and you guys like it, it's because it's fulfilling certain expected outcomes. Right, and when random coincidences occur or things that you didn't see coming, it feels like cheap storytelling. Well, those are the kinds of things that actually do happen in real life, just not very frequently, and it's just too convenient for people to use them as an escape. So, so for years now, we've been developing these deconstructions of literature in order to construct more of it. And this is an example of Joseph Campbell's monomyth. How many people have heard of Joseph Campbell and the Hero's Quest? Anything else? A little bit here? Okay. So Joseph Campbell is a guy who developed what's called the monomyth of storytelling. And it's actually highly misunderstood. So I want to take a look, just a little bit of a second on this. Campbell recognized that every one of our cultures on this planet has a story that they tell themselves, versions of a story that involve the same elements. And it's called the Hero's Quest. Okay. And it's pretty much Star Wars. If you've seen the very first Star Wars movie, Episode 4, the first one, the idea of a young hero who is called to duty, but then refuses it, and then is put to a crisis that forces him to accept it, and then he confronts an image of his father in the underworld, and he rescues his mother, and he returns to the village, and he restores truth and justice. That story is told by the Greeks, is told by Africans, is told by South Americans, it's told by Australian Aborigines. Everybody seems to have this, right? And sometimes it's not always a male, sometimes they're females. It's usually a male, though, just because of the way we drive our societies. It's certainly very adaptable to women's stories. And this is the basis for pretty much all the stories you see in video games, and everything that seems a little Star Wars-y is consciously applying Joseph Campbell. Now, Lucas, when he put the whole Star Wars thing together, did that overtly. He said, I read Joseph Campbell, that's how you tell a story, I'm going to fill in this form, all right? And what he did that made it work right is he produced fantastic consistent art design. Lots of other people who tried to do the same thing, who actually wrote movies that are probably not much worse than Star Wars, made terrible films and terrible stories out of it because they thought that all you have to do is fill in this form and you're fine. Things don't have to logically fit together and make sense. As long as you get to the underworld, that's all that matters. Okay. The monomyth is not, it's two things that it's always talked about that it's not. One, it's not a formula for writing a good story. Okay. You still have to write the good story. It's a type of story that pretty much all humans can relate to. It's a lowest common denominator. It is not the most inspired idea in the world. And the second thing is, not every story is the monomyth. This is the one that people really get confused about. And you'll probably hear this if you go into anything narrative at all. The idea that I'm going to take Ally McBeal or ER or Game of Thrones or anything else, and everything in it, every piece of story, Walter White, all of it is the hero's quest. All of it is. No, Campbell didn't say that. He said we all understand the hero's quest. There are plenty of stories that are not the hero's quest. There are plenty of other monomyths. There are plenty of other stories that exist in all cultures. Like a mother raising a child is a story that doesn't necessarily involve the child getting a lightsaber and going off and saving the galaxy. And so there are, especially again for women, a lot of stories that don't fit the monomyth as well, but there are monomyths that fit the kinds of gender roles that especially primitive societies seem to have in common for men and women. So you don't need to tell the monomyth. You can tell some other story, and given the monomyth, you're not necessarily filling in a form for a great story, but it does give you an idea of how to think about narratives so that we can fulfill the expectations of an audience. All right. So what does this all bring us to? We have invented a perception of ourselves that consciously over the years that gives us a point of view that we are the center of a moral universe that didn't really exist as an idea in the 19th century, certainly not in the 17th century. And we have applied a technology to ourselves at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, where we're learning more about what that being is, about what that self is. That it's not just this constructed, perfect, ideal, Ubermensch type of cartoon character that we used to think it is. That it's an elaborate, difficult to quantify, socially constructed, global entity that sends pictures of cats to its friends and tries to figure out who they want to vote for based upon polling people in other countries and all that kind of stuff. And we have provided psychological tools that allow this self to identify with characters in fiction and to understand the flow of a story from the point of view of what it would be like to be each of the characters, and to arrange those characters against ourselves as hypothetical friends. And the last bit of this, in terms of like what you can dig into to get a sense of what the totality of that is like, is stream of consciousness literature, which by no coincidence also rose up in the same period of time, starting in about 1915, running up, very popular up through the 70s, now not as much. But this was an effort to capture everything I just described using the technology that Miss 1915 could appreciate, okay, which was literature, right? So these authors, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, Thomas Pynchon, Marcel Proust, Chuck Palahniuk, Fight Club, right? Okay. Sylvia Plath. They all engage in a style of writing called stream of consciousness, where the idea is not to tell you a story, to sit down and say, once upon a time, and then there was a king, and then we fought, and blah, blah, blah. But to relate to you as directly as text possibly can the immediate experience of what it's like to be the characters. So Ulysses is probably, it's my favorite, it's the best example of this. Fight Club's very similar too, although it's much more of a sensory book than Ulysses is. These books just wander off into the kinds of things that are running through your head throughout the day, right? It's like you're going to class and you're going to wake up and get to your car and all this kind of stuff, and you might be thinking about like some Mickey Mouse cartoon you saw, or do I really believe this particular element of my faith, or what do I want to eat tonight? And it might be all thinking of that all at once, okay? There was an effort throughout the 20th century to write books that captured that experience. More than telling the underlying story, they captured that experience of what it's like to be living moment to moment with a undulating set of priorities. So what happens, what I want to leave you with is, if we take Miss 2115, who, as I said, might not even be able to read English, if the technology is advanced enough, English might be an obsolete idea, or language, written text might be an obsolete idea. How can we capture her stream of consciousness, right? Today we would say that it would be text or a movie or a podcast or something else like that. The experience of consciousness for her, technologically, might become very, very immediate, much more immediate than we're used to, because we moderate through language and through text and things like that. And the tools that we're going to use to build that world are the kinds of tools that we've just started out with the stone knives and bearskins level, with these personality tests and these Maslow and things like that. The tools that are going to evolve that will allow someone to just directly psychologically experience the world without necessarily moderating through interfaces is going to be the kind of world that these authors envisioned for us as they were appealing to a waking self in the 20th century. And that's the context of what you're going into when you write apps for people that send pictures of kittens to your grandma. Thank you very much.
One or two quick questions.
Yes, sir.
The augmented reality, like Google Glass stuff. Did anyone ever do like a low power laser into the cornea, anything like that? Because that would just be less interface, as you say.
Be less interface. I think there are such things in advanced research. Problem, of course, is product liability. You really don't want to be lasering people's eyes if you can avoid it. I'm skeptical of like the glass approach in general in terms of putting too much into the visual field. Right, so we're going to see a lot of this stuff is going to rise and fall, but there's definitely a sense that you need something besides a screen floating here because of just the focus issues on the eye. So something like laser imaging or direct visual cortex stimulation is probably the end of that technology, is where that technology is going to go. Little screens floating in front of your eyes, I think, have a limited lifespan. Yeah. Anything else? All right, all you augmented kids, get out there. Thank you.